legislative services, is that close enough?
Yep.
All right, for the Arizona School Board Association, and remember, Josh, we have Senator Crandall and Representative Uri here to look after what she's talking about. So anyway, you're on.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for having me very much. It's kind of a perfect timing to have a conversation too about what's happening at the Capitol, because for one of the few times we, I think, may even go before 100 days as far as just what the course is going. And you can pretty much see where this legislative session, especially with overall and then with K-12, it's about elections, it's about budgets, it's about school choice. And elections, you pretty much can look in the newspaper every day and we start wondering who's still in the legislature and who's running for Congress. So folks are sitting there and they're looking at congressional races, and also the Independent Redistricting Commission has come out with new maps. For the first time, well, this is only the second time the Independent Redistricting Commission has come out with new maps, but for the first time, we're seeing a lot of incumbents running against each other, which is creating a whole new dynamic down at the Capitol. And so kind of the demeanor there is, let's get in, let's get out. We'll look towards 2013 on that. The other item is budget. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then school choice seems to be the main issues, and then we'll go into some specific bills. But please, you know, this is your time, so feel free if there's an issue that you want to bring up. We tried to pick the kind of the big issues that are out there, and of course with Senator Crandall and Representative Uri, be sure to correct me if I go astray. Don't have to laugh too hard so far. So you saw Governor Brewer's budget. I'm not going to go through all of the items, but some items that have come up in part of the conversation. I should let you know that tomorrow in the Senate, the Appropriations Committee will be hearing from the Department of Education budget, and then in the House, it will be on Wednesday. And again, how things are a little bit different this year. Usually there's a presentation by the governor's office, there's a presentation by JLBC, and then the departments really talk about their own budgets. Well, this year, governor's office speaks, JLBC is going to speak, but then the departments will only be there to answer questions. I think they're making an exception for Superintendent Huppenthal to talk about kind of where a state of education, but it's a little bit unusual of a process, and it's much more streamlined, again, to try to get this budget process moving and get done. Items I want to bring out, the $50 million that she's proposed for the Move On When Reading on the Group A K-8 weight. That's getting a little bit of pushback from legislators for two reasons. One is that it just goes on the weight. I think there's some question about the accountability of how those dollars are being used and how can we ensure that, in fact, the dollars are being used for intervention strategies before we hit the third grade retention. So that is being met with mixed emotions. I think there's also some concern that those dollars, while Move On When Reading is important, there's a lot of other items that came in the 2010 legislative package of teacher and principal evaluations, Move On When Reading, and so should some of those dollars be invested in other areas rather than just Move On When Reading? So I would say, because that's the big dollar amount of new investment, that's the one that's getting the most conversation on there. $35 million back to increase Coral. The other big item is eliminating the building renewal formula and starting over. Let's start a brand new program. I think that there's some concern from the advocates in the lawsuit that helped create Students First, that helped create some of the building renewal programs. But then you take a look on the other side, and the fact is we've never fully funded building renewal. So do we try to start a new program and have some integrity with how we fund those programs and keep our buildings up? Or do we continue to just keep going on a building renewal formula that has never been fully funded? The reduction of the K-12 rollover, as well as the soft capital, I'll tell you, even Chuck Essex, the guru of school finance, had a hard time understanding this and actually put together a webinar that's on the School Business Officials website that John Arnold, the director of the Governor's Office of Strategic Planning and Budgeting, talked through, because it's a very, very complicated formula. I think there's some issues as far as, we're not just talking dollar amounts, we're also talking tax-based capacity that is being discussed in this. Basically, we're trying to buy down the rollover. We're rolling over about $1 billion, about 25% of K-12 funding every year. So how do we buy that down? And then at the same time, reinvesting some dollars into soft capital, because nearly all of that was gone this last year through budget cuts. And so there's a formula. We're going to take some from here, hopefully help you on some cash flow issues, but then we're going to rise up by giving you a little bit extra dollars for soft capital on that. And I'll tell you, this thing is very, very complex. I think even during that webinar, John Arnold from the governor's office didn't really understand all of the intricacies that are at play when you talk about that. The last one, district-sponsored charter schools. This one has become so controversial for some of the districts, especially more in Pima County, but no longer the ability to have district-sponsored charter schools unless you go through the charter board. No longer that you would be able to do that just as a governing board, and then some changes as well on the financing when it comes to school buildings. And so another thing that has changed a little bit this budget go-round is that the governor has put out her budget, but JLBC, all they've put out is revenue projections. So in essence, the argument is going to be about where are the revenues. The governor says one thing, the legislature says another, and then it seems like we're going to basically be working off the governor's paradigm as far as what the policy items are. So, and this is how it used to be. It hasn't been that way for about 5 or 6 years. This is how it used to be. You sit there and argue about how much money do we have, and then we decide how we're going to cut that pie. And so JLBC overall has a less rosy picture than the governor's office as far as revenues, but even so, fiscal year 12 and fiscal year 13, they're looking at a surplus, and I always make the caveat, surplus in this time means not restoration of cuts, it just means what we have cut, we'll have additional resources there. There's nothing about the restoration of some of the cuts, about $800 million worth of cuts that we've had over the few years during this economic time. This is just talking about the current paradigm. But then look at fiscal year 14. We all know at fiscal year 14, temporary 1-cent sales tax goes away, and now we're looking at a deficit, again, for ongoing revenues. So this is kind of the budget picture. Any questions on budget? The sad part, we're actually looking pretty good compared to other areas. I think if you start looking at some of the other economic numbers, though, the Finance Advisory Committee, I think if you're all on our daily updates, we put out some numbers, but they did such a great job of showing that even though this looks better, if you start looking at the real economic indicators on housing, on jobs, on unemployment rates, we have a long way to go. Those numbers are just not where they need to be for a healthy economy. So good news, but not time to start throwing a party yet. Mike?
What discussion are you hearing, if any, on the 1-cent sales tax in terms of the sunsetting? Is there any dialogue of trying to have that extended, or?
I will be providing this information as information only. There's no election items on this. There are 2 groups that are looking at the one. Well, I shouldn't say that. Actually, there's about 4 groups that are looking at what to do with the 1-cent sales tax. There are the general contractors are looking at doing a 1-cent sales tax in order for infrastructure, for roads, a little bit for universities, some for K-12, but all about jobs, economic development, growth. There's a group, the Arizona Education Network, ABA. We've been at least at the table. We're not there. We're not supporting or doing anything like that. But they're looking at using the 1-cent sales tax in order to invest in education with some different. Using the money differently, but all of that money would go to education with a 5-year phase up, phase down to help with the general fund. There is Craig Barrett, Jaime Malera, some other folks are also looking at using the 1-cent sales tax to try to reform Prop 301, if you will. Basically, the idea is that the business community really didn't get what they wanted with Prop 301, and so really recreating the Prop 301 into a more performance-based item. And then there are others of looking at the 1-cent as a debt reduction. Do we sit there and try to pay off some debt over the next 5 to 7 years? So there are 2 groups talking. There's a lot of talk. As far as what happens, it will be interesting. But I think what's at the Arizona Ready Council, which is the Governor Brewer's P20, they showed some poll results, and what's interesting is that the public is negative of almost every single thing when you talk about tax increases, other items, except when it comes to extending the sales tax, which is so funny because that temporary was such an important issue, both for the governor as well as for the advocates at